right, I'm going to get started, okay? Okay, well, welcome everybody. If you don't know, if there's some undergrads here that don't know who I am, I'm Julie Larson. I'm the chair of the graduate program. And it's my pleasure to introduce you to this year's graduate program design research workshop series. And we have, if you don't know much about what we are doing in the grad program with this series, I just want to tell you briefly something about that before I introduce Katie and Kyle. So each year we offer a series of workshops that are for the graduate students in order to actually bring in outside critics to the school in the hopes that we will start to kind of generate and get kind of exposure to different ways of thinking, generate new ideas, things that are really kind of emergent and happening kind of potentially on the periphery, sometimes very much to the core, but really kind of engaging in new kind of methodologies and new technologies that are happening really kind of around the country, around the world. And so I'm, attempt to bring in like all these outside critics as a way to kind of infuse the program with different kind of approaches to design and architecture. So this is really kind of a great opportunity for the graduate students to start to gain new knowledge, start to think about how the kind of field of architecture starts to be influenced by these outside conversations. So last year, if you recall, that was the theme of that was the aesthetics of AI. And this year, the theme is crafting with machines, imagery, coding, and materials as generative instruments. So this year's workshops are really kind of giving the students a set of kind of experimentations and explorations that give them a chance to be inventive and speculative about how to kind of think about the kind of increasingly kind of pervasive combination of thinking about traditional craftsmanship along with new technologies in the hopes that these machines and these tools start to give them ways to think about being a kind of active participant with those tools. And it's not just something that they do kind of at the end, but it's very much part of the design process. And it's really a chance to start to kind of enhance their design methodologies as well and find like ways to kind of incorporate that potentially into other areas like design studio and maybe, I don't know, a design pavilion that's coming up. Which already I'm starting to see there is a lot of influence on what you guys have been talking with them about, which is exciting. So these are all like kind of in the hopes of really kind of bringing these kind of fresh perspectives. So with that, it brings me to wanting to warmly introduce you to After Architecture, which is Katie MacDonald and Kyle Schumann. So thank you very much for joining us. We really appreciate it. And I just want to give you guys a little bit of a kind of background to Katie and Kyle. First of all, they are coming from Virginia, UVA, and they're assistant professors of architecture at UVA. And they have the office After Architecture, but they're also co-directing the Before Building Laboratories, which I'm sure they'll explain a little bit about. The lab and their office they're really dealing with issues of like leading robotic fabrication and research and development. And they're really pioneers in biomaterial assemblies with the aim of creating sustainable building material systems by deploying both analog tools along with emerging technologies to collaborate with different kind of natural materials. They seek to advance the accessibility of digital fabrication and inventing and building low-cost ground-up fabrication and imaging systems. Their work proposes an expanded approach in which architects conceptualize and execute not just single projects, but the systems, methods, and technologies that enable their production, a shift in the respective agencies of architect, builder, and factory. In 2023, they were awarded the Architecture League Prize for the Young Architects and Designers and the Design Build Award from the ACSA. And Katie was named, I hope I have this right, was named Educator of the Year in Metropolis. So congratulations for that. And their work has been recently showcased at Exhibit Columbus, among many, many other kind of areas. I think that they are doing extraordinary work, and I'm really excited to have them both here. So thank you very much, and welcome, Katie and Kyle.
Thanks so much, Julie, for the warm introduction, flattering introduction, and also for the invitation to be here and to teach this fabrication workshop this semester. We're grateful to the students in the workshop who've been hard at work reimagining how logs are transformed into building products. And we'll hope you'll join us for our kind of celebration and closing on Monday. We've all kind of been long-term admirers of the pedagogy and design culture here at Syracuse, so we're honored by the opportunity to share our work with you. So we're going to begin today by kind of structuring our talk around a series of material lenses, from effects and inventories to geometries and assemblies. And we'll share a few projects to elucidate each category. Maturing digital tools allow us to reimagine traditional constraints on material economies and labor. In our practice, we deploy both analog tools and emerging technologies in order to collaborate with natural materials. And so here you see kind of two sides of our practice and that have really influenced how we work over time, which is delivering kind of projects in more traditional construction assemblies, and then also working with new tools and finding the kind of opportunities and overlaps between both. We're interested in making computational construction technologies low cost and accessible. And we work in two ways. Our collaboration together as a kind of team of two began while we were still undergraduate students as after architecture. Since then, our work has been kind of facilitated through two modes of practice, the studio and then the lab. And so in our kind of studio, an interest in making through craft, digital technologies, and traditional construction has undergirded our work. We started our practice by designing and building permanent works of public art, often doubling as furniture or lighting. And this kind of built up and developed to starting to make building provocations that were questioning the kind of construction techniques and sustainability of the building project. So each of these house projects leverage thermal mass to create kind of a microclimate for the inhabitants. Here we explore the design process from scales of kind of landscape to household object. There is a kind of tablescape providing a vehicle for cohabitation with plant life, a chair co-authored with barley root, and a kind of undulating ground plane that ripples to become both seating and stage. Now, as a complement to our professional practice, we co-direct an academic research laboratory. And here our work really multiplies from a team of two to a team of many. We work with undergraduate and graduate kind of paid student research assistants to advance circular construction techniques. And so in our lab, we're able to really experiment and push the boundaries of what's possible. And then we see practice as a way to kind of implement those things that we found to be successful in the lab. Our body of work in the lab includes assemblies made of grass or invasive plant species. The collaboration with natural materials starts to create a kind of complement to the digital turn, which is an architecture that is kind of fuzzy or fluffy or furry or shaggy.
So through this work, we seek to work with unconventional materials in new ways. And that often finds friction with the available tools that we have at our disposal as designers and academics. So many of these tools, including the humble drill illustrated here on the left, have existed and been developed by humanity in some cases over millennia, and they've been developed sort of in parallel with the materials that they're designed to work with. In many cases, this means that these tools have kind of inherent biases that preference a certain type of material or process. And so if we think about, for example, the kind of standardization of lumber and the development of dimensional lumber, we see sort of at the same time the implementation of a number of kind of tables and fences on saws and drills and other tools that are built that have that orthogonality in geometry as a kind of precondition or assumption for what the tools are going to be working with and how they're going to be performing cuts and other operations on that material. So in response to this, our process often demands that we find ways to sometimes intentionally misuse tools safely, of course, but also sometimes we have to invent totally new ones or substantially modify the tools that we're using. And so as a first example, on the screen here, you see a pneumatic forming machine we call pillow forming, patent pending. It's an inflatable sort of large-scale panel that's controlled directly from a Rhino model. And it allows us to form complex and irregular topographic surfaces that can be repeatable or kind of different in geometry every time. And so that device has been used in some of our previous work, working with invasive plant species and other things. But we'd like to focus today more on some other sort of materials that we've been working with more recently. So our work now, an ongoing body of research, is motivated by the potential for better building techniques that improve environmental health. And so if we look at some statistics really briefly that I'm sure many of you are aware of, the built environment currently accounts for 39% of global carbon emissions, right? So we're a kind of huge global player or kind of burden in that space. If we think about the scale of construction, there'll be 2.5 trillion square feet of new construction by 2060. Which is equal to the entire extant building global building stock today. So we're going to essentially double the number of buildings on the planet, in the next couple of decades. On the other side, on the kind of material side of things, looking specifically at timber, we find that 48% of harvested timber is unusable in its whole state, and that means that a couple of things happen to that material. Oftentimes, it's broken down into chips, composited into products like OSB or MDF. Which is great. We're using that material. There's an efficiency to that, but that also introduces formaldehyde adhesives and poses challenges for what happens to that material at the end of its life cycle. Or that material is sort of burned for fuel, which is very energy efficient, but also releases its stored carbon into the atmosphere. And so we ask, what other potentials might there be for timber construction if we look at using some of the other parts of the tree that are waste in the typical process. So in response, we look at material intelligence, and this theme is going to kind of span a lot of the work and projects that we'll share today. And so we reimagine traditional constraints on material economies and labor through this work, and we seek to deploy emerging technologies to facilitate collaboration with the innate intelligence of natural materials. Sometimes this involves leveraging scanning technologies, so everybody can get kind of 3D scanning apps on their smartphone now, right? I'm sure a lot of you have kind of experimented with that technology. In some cases, we seek to develop our own tools that are more kind of less data intensive to allow us to work more easily with larger quantities or inventories of material. And we also work to build our own fabrication systems, and we'll share a couple examples today. On this slide, I also want to address the title of the talk today, Decanting the Log. So as a bit of kind of background there, we're thinking about decanting the log in two ways. And these themes are going to run throughout the talk today. One being kind of decanting wine as a kind of temporal and material practice that's meant to kind of make that material more palatable to the human. So thinking about kind of your reception to that material or the kind of cultural baggage of that material. On the other side of this, it's more about processing that material. So in the kind of logging lumber world, we find there's a lot of really great terminology, one of which is a cant. And so a cant is usually what you produce as the first step of turning a log into lumber, when you basically take that kind of amazing geometry of the tree and simplify it down to basically the largest rectilinear prism or box that can be cut out of that material, after which you can easily process it into linear dimensional lumber. And so we want to challenge that assumption that we kind of automatically start with a cant at the beginning of the milling process.
So the kind of tradition that we've adopted as a society of turning trees into the kind of orthogonal unit really results in impacts on a range of a whole host of other products, down to even the kind of size of a pickup truck bed. And so each kind of unit becomes part of this larger ethos of subtraction and standardization. And even as, you know, we see a kind of return to customization in the wake of or after the digital turn, usually we're still starting with kind of standard units and turning them into complex geometry rather than leveraging the, you know, kind of unique complex geometry of the starting unit. So as designers and researchers, we're interested in alternative approaches to thinking about wood. And we like these two pieces by architect Alan Wexler and Andy Goldsworthy in kind of talking about ways that the natural material might accommodate some of our larger ambitions. In the case of Wexler's project, he's taking the kind of meandering trunk of a log and straightening it by a process of addition, the insertion of wedges. And in the case of Goldsworthy, he's lining up curves and straight members to create a kind of longer assembly. Mario Carpo makes note that the timber industry is already using scanning in widespread ways to maximize lumber production. And so the kind of technology is there. But he also kind of notes that the only way to deal with the inherent capriciousness of living materials is to react to their whims and volitions on the spot and on the fly. So the kind of first section of projects that we'll share today speak about material effects. The first in a kind of long-standing tradition of charring wood, and the second in a kind of collaboration with neuroscientists to study how wood affects the brain. So located in northeast Washington, D.C., the Camp Barker Memorial responds to the landscape of American monuments that valorize performance in battle, instead taking form as a series of spatial markers which convey a complicated history. The memorial was designed and commissioned in early 2017 and completed in 2019, a period when the role of Civil War monuments was being reconsidered, and the project advocates for the significance of counter-narratives. So the Camp Barker Memorial answers a brief for the design of 3 entry gateways to an elementary school by framing and revealing the site's history as a Civil War era contraband camp. This was a typology specific to the Civil War, which was in a way a kind of refugee camp for those escaping slavery, and yet conditions were very rough. Occupants did not enjoy full rights, and so there were kind of very challenging environments on the pathway to freedom. In conceiving of this project, we looked at kind of Adrian Parr's comments on memorial culture as utopian memory thinking, and really how Parr places the kind of need for the solemn reflection with a kind of tension of joy and hope in the future. And this is a kind of quote that resonated with us working on a memorial on an elementary school campus. So the project responds to the kind of object-centered urbanism of the capital, instead proposing the memorial as a kind of threshold or perimeter condition. In contrast to many of the kind of monuments you'll find in DC, which are centered, the series of portals line an urban block and provide a kind of passage into the grounds which double as a public park. The material kind of message and performance of the portals is also a kind of cultural response to the language of monuments in DC. Borrowing from the Japanese shosugi bond technique, wood is charred in order to become UV resistant, bug resistant, kind of gain language that complements or contrasts the white stone of DC. And then a brass liner is inserted as a complement to the shosugi bond exterior. An artist known for her pictorial works related to African American history produced a series of panels which are integrated into the thickness of each portal. And so the end result is this series of kind of portals that thicken and thin, that fold to provide kind of covering and engage the scale of the child on these entryways to an public elementary school. The second project we'll share looks at material in terms of its effects on the human inhabitant. So this was a collaboration with a team of environmental psychologists and neuroscientists who are really interested in how the brain responds to conventional materials versus kind of new developments in biomaterials and also the kind of traditional wood construction. So working with our collaborators in the sciences, we developed a protocol for the experiment, which consisted of having a kind of control chamber and a biomaterial chamber. And so each participant would be exposed to a kind of stressor, then go into and spend time in each environment, have a break, be exposed to another stressor, and then experience the second chamber. The chambers were going to be temporarily located in the psychology building, so they're designed as a kind of panelized assembly that can be dismounted and assembled again elsewhere. The scale of the occupant as seating allows for testing during the psychological assessment and then repurposing as study pods in the chamber's afterlife. So titled Sheets and Slabs, one chamber is clad in live edge slabs. The second is clad in drywall. Each space kind of funnels to a skylight and incorporates an integrated seating element. Here you see the EEG headsets that participants wore during testing. Here's the construction site on campus from which we sourced trees for this project. So the assembly takes the kind of slab and begins to scribe one onto the next. And preliminary results are showing kind of positive neurological effects of the wood environment versus the drywall environment. But this will be published in the near future. So we'll share that with you when it's available.
So we like to think about that work playing a specific role in that project in particular, playing a specific role relative to most of our work, which is really about the fabrication processes that go into working with these materials and understanding with them in new ways. And so we're excited by the potentials of that project to kind of generate new interest in the kind of timber industry. And we think architects have a lot of agency to kind of work in that realm between kind of science and industry and academia and practice to make kind of new projects and innovation happen. So our next section is on material inventories. And as mentioned earlier, we use a lot of kind of 3D scanning technologies for this. This technology is not new. Here we see Frank Gehry's office using a kind of early 3D pantograph to digitize a physical model back in 1991. But these technologies are kind of becoming much more easy to kind of use at a larger scale and increasingly accessible and affordable. And so thinking back to kind of some of the examples that Katie was showing, looking at early kind of digital fabrication techniques, there's really the system where we go from kind of taking the complexity of natural materials, standardizing those into kind of dimensional lumber or sheet materials like plywood, and then reproducing complexity of form through a digital subtractive process. And so we see the introduction of scanning techniques really as being one that can mediate these kind of two ends of the spectrum of originating form and sort of designed form, and incorporate some of the eccentricities of these natural materials fluidly as part of that design process. And so this proposes a slightly shifted model when we think about how architecture is produced, typically going from design to acquiring materials, kind of bidding that out, and then contractors being responsible for means and methods. And now there's a kind of dialogue potentially between potential material inventories and the design, where there might be a kind of true collaboration here between architects and designers and the material that's being used, and that information and material will then feed directly into construction processes. So the first project here is called Tangential Timber. This is a thin shell dome structure constructed of wood rounds or cookies. I mentioned there's all these great terms in the timber world. We didn't invent that, I wish we did, but these are referred to affectionately as cookies. And so this project really looked at scanning and digitizing that material, which if we did this with traditional photogrammetry techniques or other 3D scanning techniques, this would have crashed my laptop, quite honestly, looking at an inventory of over 160 unique pieces of material. And so instead, we looked at distilling that information down to what we actually needed to know about this material in order to model and then fabricate with it. And it turned out that was basically a traced 2D profile that was extruded into a simple volume in Rhino. And so we developed a custom method for constructing models of each piece of material using only a single photograph of each. And so the dots that you see here are registration marks that are red in Rhino and Grasshopper and are used to correct for perspectival distortion, scale this material, trace it, and construct those 3D models using only a single photograph. The cookies are then, as a kind of demonstration pavilion, that's a thin shell compression arch. So we modeled that digitally and then flattened that geometry, sorted the cookies across it, as you see in the center image, with larger cookies on the outside or bottom of the structure, smaller cookies at the middle or the top, and used some simple spring simulations to pull that material together so that each geometry was kind of informing how these pieces fit, with the specific overlap providing a way to control the kind of joint logic between the pieces. And so we went from kind of images documenting the material like this, with the T-shaped marks also providing critical information to track the orientation of each piece of material, both digitally and physically, to prototype joints like this that read as a kind of shingle on one side and a dovetail kind of joinery on the other, to then producing the actual pieces. And so there's a two-step fabrication process here using a 5-axis water jet to cut the joints, and more traditional 3-axis CNC milling to mill this grain onto the cookies. And so the fabrication began with using a kind of traditional sawmill and pieces of lumber that were too short to be used, or logs that were too short to be used as lumber, basically, so they would be otherwise chipped for mulch and sent back into the landscape. And those were cut into an inventory of cookies that were then scanned. Here you see the water jet cutting that joinery in one of these units, followed by a CNC milling of each piece. And so tracking the positioning of each of these, both digitally and physically, was a really kind of important part of this process. And then it's easily assembled with each piece locking together by 1 or 2 people with minimal scaffolding. And so you can see as soon as the arches start to connect together, it becomes pretty much self-supporting very quickly. And so the resulting structure has different sizes of arched openings on each side, allowing for entry and exit, and some slight kind of different geometries and different profiles. The exterior reads as a kind of memory of the flatness of that material that we began with, and so you have these misalignments between those faces as they come together. And the interior takes on what we like to think of as a second wood grain overlaid on the first wood grain. This one is a custom tool path that's related to the kind of principal stress lines flowing through the material, and so that those structural kind of forces through the thin shell become articulated as this new kind of aesthetic quality overlaid on the grain of the wood itself. And we're really excited. Half of the dome is currently on display at the Craft Contemporary Museum as part of the Material Acts exhibition in Los Angeles. Another project looking at kind of how we deal with these digital inventories is a much quicker one that was part of a workshop we did at UT Austin last year, which we call Surfacing Roundwood. And in the image on the left, this is the kind of texture map that you get using traditional scanning processes on just a smartphone app. But you still see that T-shaped mark on the upper left being really important to track the position of that material in our digital model. And so in this case, we were really interested in seeing how the quality, the geometry of the material can generate the form of the structure. And so we developed a kind of quick custom workflow with an end effector on a robotic arm. This is just a regular bandsaw literally bolted to the machine. So it's actually quite easy, deceptively easy to do, as long as you're tracking your positioning and getting it set up right. And on the left, you see a kind of grasshopper and rhino model that's actually analyzing that 3D scan of that material, finding its kind of center line and generating cuts in relationship to that geometry. And so you're sort of setting these parameters and then allowing the material to have a lot of agency in determining the form of the structure, and you can end up with sort of twisting cuts like this one. And so that was assembled into a very simple column meant to contrast between the more traditional kind of method of canting, right? Making the log orthogonal on the bottom, that then becomes a more kind of naturally branching capital as the material informs the deformation of the top half of the column.
So the next section will look at how milling wood into specific geometries can enhance the structural performance, allowing for thinner structures and potential optimization of their kind of natural geometries. So this project was developed for Exhibit Columbus. And the project really started with the kind of simple assignment of a site. The site for our project was a planter in between the visitor center, which was renovated by Kevin Roche, and the library in Columbus, Indiana, which was designed by IMP. And so for those who don't know Columbus, Indiana, it's a really kind of magical place. It has 50,000 people, but 86 kind of major works of architecture. So the amount of landmark buildings is just really incredible. But something kind of interesting about the designs of these mid-century spaces is they're really kind of out of scale with the population. So they're lovely, but enormous and often feel not populated. So we were kind of approaching that condition while also being in the context of a significant church across the street by Alil Saranin, which was under renovation. So we had this kind of renovation project going on across the street. And then just a couple doors down, the Irwin Block, a significant Queen Anne style building, burned down as we were kind of designing the project. So we thought about this kind of renovation and also this kind of demolition or destruction or fire as a potential material opportunity. And here you see that large scale planter with a kind of lovely grove of trees inside. Our kind of urban strategy for the project was to develop a meandering line that could activate the edge of the planter, intersecting arcs with lines to create a series of kind of nooks, overlooks, and thresholds. And we were hoping to kind of use this robotic bandsaw sawmill that we had just developed for the first time on this project. So for those of you in the workshop, you know a lot more about this, and we've been using this all week to create much crazier members, I might say. But this was our kind of first project using the sawmill, and so we were trying to limit the complexity to a kind of 2D arc, extruded arc. So in the project, we used the arc and series of different arcs in plan in order to create nested pieces when we cut the members. This produced, some ways to create such like long curved members without using a significant amount of material. And it also allowed us to use small pieces and kind of composite them into a longer panel. We were interested in how arced pieces could form a kind of different model to mass timber panels, which are traditionally planar. And so we were combining this kind of arced methodology with also a threaded rod methodology that would make it possible to assemble by hand and not use adhesives. This results in a integrated spring detail on the top level, which allows for expansion and contraction of moisture content of the wood. The straight members of the assembly are reclaimed lumber from a decommissioned barn. The pieces were 3 inches wide in order to maximize the kind of 3.5-inch standard lumber dimension and allow it to be kind of refinished. So here you see our kind of cut sheet for the pieces of this project. The meandering line varies in vertical height across its length in order to create different scaled spaces. In plan, that plays out as a kind of intersection of this 3-inch wide wood line with the brick planter, where the wood kind of easily comes in and out of the brick box. The secondary material systems, which I alluded to on the first slide, were the reclaimed bricks from the Irwin block down the street, which burned down, and the reclaimed bricks from the renovation of the Saarinen Church Tower. A selection of these were water jet and painted to add a kind of playful component to their reuse. These bricks were collected in a series of custom gabion cages that augmented the existing brick wall.
And these patterns reference the paleo print by Alexander Gerard, a famous textile designer, excuse me, who also played a large role in a lot of the interiors and develops kind of schemes for the main street of Columbus as well. So we're referencing that local design history.
The kind of last twist to the project was a table that composed scraps from our construction, as well as the plastic panels from the Saarinen church facade, which were being replaced with stone. And so here you see some kind of final shots of the project with the 3 systems coming together.
We also like the way that the cutting of these curved arcs through the log produces a kind of transparency and through the structure and reveals some kind of different curves where the bark is actually a part of the piece, and we feel that that has a dialogue with this large monumental sculpture, Large Arch by Henry Moore, that's located in the back of the photo.
The next project, Crinkle Cuts, was developed for a workshop at NJIT this spring. And it might look most familiar to those in the workshop because we're building off of this trajectory. The Crinkle Cuts project uses ash trees felled by the invasive emerald ash borer. And so something that we found interesting about these specimens was the markings that the insect kind of tattoos into the wood. And we've found that to be a kind of source of geometrical inspiration for our approach. In this project, we're cutting these ash logs in 2 directions with sinusoidal curves or waves in order to produce a series of members which are waving in 2 directions. And this allows us for kind of expanding the footprint of the wood, both in plan and in section, towards the end of getting many members out of a single log, but being able to create a kind of porous, thin, lightweight structure. So in this kind of process, you end up with the kind of live edge units and then the uniform units. So you see the uniform units on the left and the live edge units on the right. And so the design took that into consideration and created a kind of banding on the bottom of live edge units and then a kind of top component of uniform units so that the thicker members would be located near the base of the assembly and the thinner members would be at the top. Seen from its interior, from above, each member, appears uniform, but the exterior reveals the live edge on that bottom course. Here you see some of those markings from the ash borer kind of complementing the waving facade of the unit.
So our last section is on material assemblies. And so we'll look at some of the larger scale implications of these projects. And so the first is called Hearth. This is a kind of backwoods cabin sited in a small town in rural Vermont that we first designed back in 2014. It went through kind of several iterations and has been a kind of longer term design build project for us. So everything that you see here, except for the foundation, which was cast by others, we constructed ourselves with our own floor hands. Can I say that? And so the idea for this project was really to look at, not dissimilarly from Camp Barker Memorial that Katie described at the beginning, think about the kind of cultural associations we have with different materials or material systems, or in this case, typologies. And so we were looking a lot at what does a kind of log cabin represent in the cultural imagination, thinking about things like maple syrup cans that are kind of shaped like log cabins, and there were a series of elements then that we found that were kind of typical of the cabin in the imagination, and that was a chimney, a porch, and a stack of firewood. And so we looked at taking those discrete elements and rearranging and kind of systematizing those to create almost an inhabitable chimney, or a building that was kind of layered from the inside out, from the hearth to the space to the facade to the porch and the stack of firewood, which became an open range screen system for the storage of logs on the facade. And so you can see in some of these very early sections, this is the first version of the project. On the left, how the roof kind of tapers down and these kind of thin horizontal members slide off and produce kind of thickness that provides the shelving in which the firewood can be stored. And then on the right, some diagrammatic elevations referencing the fact that the building becomes a kind of record of one's interaction with the surrounding forest over the course of the year, as firewood is sort of gathered and stored and then removed and consumed for warmth in the winter seasons. And so from the very early stages, we were really interested in the constructability of this project. Since this started, I think quite a few years ago, we were looking more at kind of traditional conventional building systems for the structure of the project. And as we've layered more and more into this design, where we're now bringing our more experimental material research into this process. And so this was the first rendering we did back in the day, imagining that cabin in its context. And now photos of the current state of the cabin, which is completed on the exterior and is soon to be finished on the interior. One of the big design changes was the introduction of these two volumes, one kind of higher up on the left that projects out, that's a space for resting and a kind of lofted space within the structure, and the other kind of larger one closer to ground level on the right, which becomes a kind of 7-foot square extruded through the thickness of that rain screen, and it becomes a kind of hybrid of window and porch in the building. And here you see a detail on that corner of how that rain screen slides down the facade and pulls off to produce the thickness for storing firewood. And so one of the things we're really excited about and are currently working on is bringing some of this logic of cutting logs and working with cookies into a kind of new form of cordwood structure, cordwood floor for the project. And so we're looking at using, again, in this case, beetle kill ash procured locally from the site of the cabin to make a kind of floor structure, but also how that can then transition vertically into the hearth and some of the furniture elements within the project.
So the last project we'll show is a series of projective models, which take some of the techniques that we've developed in our prototypes and pavilions and combine them into kind of larger scale interventions. Here we imagine the kind of curved wood walls of the Exhibit Columbus project becoming the logic for a smooth, meandering series of enclosures within a house, complete with a kind of timber terrazzo, cordwood-like floor, and a second scheme in which the kind of cookie vault of the tangential timber project transitions into taller, thinner walls, also out of the kind of same technique. and allows for aperture and courtyard to be cut into this kind of system.
And so part of these models is an ambition to think about what role do these strategies, fabrication strategies, play in how we might read the materials differently at larger scales, in buildings. And we find that a lot of our work through the research laboratory, at least, is relatively small scale. We often have to explain to people how it could become architecture. But we really see them all as being spatial propositions. They're not kind of traditional buildings, with enclosure and air conditioning necessarily. But we like to work with those as kind of full-scale prototypes always to prove out a specific material strategy or fabrication process. So if there's kind of believability, a tangibility to that, then we can test the kind of experiential effects of those strategies, and then explore the larger spatial opportunities through models like this.
So together the work proposes a kind of expanded approach in which architects conceptualize and execute not just single projects, but the systems, methodologies, and technologies that enable their production. And we'll end with a quick video that I think we can leave playing as we open up for questions. Thank you.
So we wanted to share this just as some visualization of some of the tooling and the techniques that we're using in the projects. But we'd love to answer any questions that you have.
Is this working? There we go. Thank you both. Maybe as people are thinking of some questions, I wouldn't mind like knowing a little bit about like just the process of where you go to like extract the logs, and just that's one question, and just like how do you guys make the decision, where do you go? Or is there, obviously some constraints or issues with that, if it's just like you can just go to the forest or not.
Yeah.
We just have to go to certain places. And then the second kind of larger kind of conceptual question for me is, if for the students anyway, is this idea of the indeterminacy of all the variability that you have to embrace and accept and know that you have to design for that, and what maybe some of those challenges are, because I'm always trying to get them to think about beyond just their Rhino models, and like as soon as you start to think about materials, they have a very kind of profound impact on your way of working and the kind of construction or the logic and the kind of material effects, right? And that leap is always like kind of hard, but I think like the exciting thing is that you're able to like embrace that. There's probably challenges with it, of course, but being able to like have that ability, foresight to see like where you can like let go and not necessarily know what you're going to end up with exactly, but how do you kind of work with that as a, what you want it to be versus like what you're willing to give up, I guess. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think part of the way that we like started working with these materials is because we wanted to do material-based work, but we didn't have a lot of grant funds as we were starting up, right? So we had to be kind of opportunistic about what material was available to us. So when we did this joint fellowship together at the University of Tennessee, we started contacting like wilderness planning organizations who were happy for us to harvest their invasive plant species and have material, for our own research, but also for students to work with. And I think that's one of the kind of opportunity spaces of natural materials, is like there's often ways to source them locally, at a small scale, to allow for some of that experimentation, which otherwise can get expensive in school. Someone who went to school with Shigeru Ban told me that he was an exchange student and he didn't have a lot of extra funds for materials, and so he would use the like paper rolls, paper tube rolls that were about the architecture school. That kind of turned into like a Pritzker Prize winning practice, you know? So I mean, I don't know if that's true, but I like it as a kind of thought that like having to be opportunistic and having to take something that people don't find valuable, you know, yields great results or new thinking. So that might be a roundabout way of saying like, yeah, I think it is challenging to work with natural materials. The tools resist it, right? Like it's harder to draw in the computer perhaps, but it can also be like a great way to work with your hands with, you know, without spending a lot of money at Lowe's or something, so, yeah.
And I think that's part of the challenge of this kind of work. I think at some point during every project we say, oh, this would have been much easier if we could just go to Home Depot and buy 2x4s, because we're like designing the project and oftentimes building it ourselves or with student research assistants, and that doesn't involve just, you know, assembling, you know, pre-made pieces of building materials, but going into the forest with a chainsaw and a trailer, like cutting the logs, dragging them out, like cutting them on your custom tool, which you also built, right? And so I have to troubleshoot along the way. And so there's just a lot of complexity to it. But I think part of your question about like, do you deal with those challenges in the design process? We like to see those kind of material irregularities, for example, or certain qualities as opportunities. So it's easy to like have all these constraints and say, oh, this is too difficult. But if you really start focusing in on kind of experimenting with the material at a small scale, analyzing it, sort of finding opportunities and being specific about like what qualities are you interested in. If it's the geometry of the material, if it's the grain pattern of the tree. In the chair that we showed at the beginning, growing with barley, it was actually the behavior of that barley, like how do the roots grow in relationship to gravity versus the blades growing in relationship to light. Like those are the parameters of the behaviors of the material that you have to work with. And so you then become kind of a collaborator in the process. You're still largely in charge of, or in control of the process, right? But you get to kind of, in a lot of cases, use your design skills or use technology sometimes as a mediator to bring sort of forward like those qualities of the material that you're interested in.
I like that you're thinking about it as you're a collaborator with these tools. That's a nice way to look at it, that it's a give and take to that. Yeah, that's nice. Yes, please.
Hello. Hi. Beautiful talk. I was thinking, you mentioned many times, like your process is not so much about the thing, but it's like the process or developing a technique or a way of working or something like this, or making a new tool. But your work is also very beautiful. So I guess like I was curious about the aesthetic question, like what wins, you know? Is ultimately if something is ugly, but the process to get there was fruitful, is that a win? Or does it have to be beautiful in the end?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think ugly is maybe in the eye of the beholder, right? So something that is ugly to us might not be ugly to other people.
I tell my students no, I can tell them what's
yeah, but no, that's a really good question. Do you want to start?
Go ahead.
I just lost my train of thought talking about ugly. But I think fundamentally, like we're trained as designers. We both have undergraduate and graduate degrees in architecture, and so we really like come to projects with a kind of like spatial agenda. We want to like explore like space and experience through form and structure. We're not trained as neuroscientists or structural engineers. We like have collaborators for a lot of those things, and that's part of what's so great about working through a research lab at the university is that we can kind of draw on others' experience. But when we're thinking about kind of, I don't know, how a certain project takes shape, or we might start with a kind of material or fabrication process, and again, have a desire to have it end in a kind of built kind of full-scale prototype so we can have that spatial experience. Oftentimes that requires kind of creating a set of criteria for ourselves, essentially about like, what are we trying to prove with this system, right? Where are the opportunities in it, and how can those inform like how the thing takes shape as a work of space or a work of architecture?
I think it's a good question, and I think maybe it's about resolution, right? Like when you're trying to invent something or prototype something or embrace a process, like at what point does it end in a resolved thing? And you know, and it doesn't always, right? I think we show the things that are maybe more resolved.
Sure.
And some ideas are like still simmering on the stove, and we hope we'll figure it out. Yeah, I think there's just like anything, there's a lot of like iterations, and you know, not all of them are successful. But we try to get to a point of like clarity and coherence, which you might call beauty, but I think we try to reach some point of like resolution.
Yeah, and oftentimes that requires like a lot of curation and restraint in the process, right? Because in some cases the material is doing so much for you aesthetically that like bringing like, you know, exuberant form into it is like kind of too much at once, right? And so part of this, again, going back to Julie's question too about the negotiation between like your design intent and the material and the process, is about deciding like when does one sort of need to be pulled back to let the other one, you know, show through or do more of that aesthetic work for you.
I think that's a good point. A couple years ago, we curated this exhibition at UVA called the Biomaterial Building Exposition, and we invited kind of 5 teams from outside of the university to display their projects. And they produced kind of renderings and drawings of what the things were going to be. And some of them, they looked a little bit, you know.
They were great.
They looked great. They looked great. But some of them you didn't really like get in the drawings or renderings. But then as they became physical artifacts, like with the material qualities, they were totally transformed.
Every one of them, yeah.
And so I think that's one of the challenges with working with natural materials rather than like perfect steel or concrete. It's just like it wants to say something, and so you have to hold back a little bit everything you want to say.
Hi, sorry. First of all, great to see you guys in person. I have 2 questions, if time allows for that. One is kind of building on Julie's question. I know you guys talked about collaborating with different like organizations to get rid of invasive species and to use those materials. And you also talked about, which I'm sure this was just kind of like shorthand for the process, but like, you know, go into the woods with a chainsaw. Are you also like, whenever you are going to harvest these materials, are different like, I guess like environmental specialists or like field workers also there to help with like root removal? I know there are like some like invasive species, like a lot of my family has farms and they have honeysuckle and you have to like burn it out. So I like, whenever you guys are like taking, like, are you also like, are other people dealing with like root removal or like trying to have like preventative, I guess, techniques in order to, or like methods to like not have those invasive species grow back? Or like can you guys go into that process a little more? Yeah. Sorry, that's kind of convoluted.
Yeah, I think that's an important like question too. Is like, okay, how much of this are you doing and how are you doing it? And I would say in our like most recent work, we're benefiting from a group at UVA, which is called UVA Sawmilling, which kind of like stockpiles logs that come down on the campus. So a lot of times we're getting those from them and we don't have to go cut anything down. The one like project, the crinkle cuts project that we did, we like got the ash logs out of a forest by the fabrication facility, but they were already felled on the ground and stuff. So we were chainsawing them into smaller pieces, but not like cutting anything down. So we haven't like cut down any live trees.
No, we try to, yeah, we're using trees that are largely waste, you know, but we have dealt with, like in the work in Tennessee, working with like these community organizations that need to do remediation for invasive species. Like we took students and went out into the field with them, and they have all these processes they use for doing that, right? You want to remove a lot of the material. They also use, unfortunately, a lot of like chemicals to kind of treat and kill off those species. There's some really interesting processes they use with like girdling, for instance, is a process of kind of removing the live layer of bark in the ring along the bottom of the tree, which will cut off the supply of nutrients and water up and down and sort of kill off that tree as it's standing, right? But in some cases, like kudzu, which is the poster child for invasive species, the vine that ate the South, we found that that was a really interesting one to work with because everybody had a story about it, right? In places where kudzu lives, so like that stuff was all over my neighbor's fence. We spent like weeks trying to get rid of it. It doesn't work. We had heard stories about it kind of being removed from an area, and then a large tree would fall, sunlight would hit the ground, and these like root structures of kudzu that were dormant for 10 years would all of a sudden, you know, come back and grow. And in that case, some of the most effective techniques are like bringing in goats and just letting the goats like eat all the kudzu. So So it's kind of dependent on the species, I think, in that case. But yeah, as Katie mentioned, for a lot of the timber stuff right now, we have this amazing group at UVA that we're close collaborators with, and they're really working in a kind of urban forestry type of operation. And so they're not really like going out and harvesting trees as we do in kind of large-scale forestry, but they're kind of finding trees that are either coming down for construction or due to storms or for other reasons, and gathering that material, which would otherwise like end up in the landfill or get mulched, basically. And they get some really amazing kind of timbers from that if you like collect that material, cut it, dry it properly. And it's kind of amazing what you can do. And that's a growing movement. There are groups in New York that are doing this with the public park system there. Yeah, we're really excited for some of those potentials. But then you get into questions of like grading that lumber, using it in structural applications, and that's where some of our work is going currently, is looking at some of those challenges with hardwoods versus softwoods, for example.
Sweet, thank you for answering that. Also, my second one is regarding the, I don't remember the exact name, like the Hearth project. You talked about rearranging the different elements, and I know like some of it's still like in progress right now. Can you talk more about the rearranged element of like the porch and how that like fits in with it? Just because like that was in Tennessee, right?
That one's in Vermont.
That one's in, that one's in Vermont. Okay, yeah. I was thinking from like a southern perspective on that. Could you guys still like talk about how like the porch factors into the design? Is that sort of like the projection of the roof, or is there like other elements that sort of like take on that same like concept?
Sure. Yeah. I get that.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So the kind of first design, that cabin was actually originally a competition entry that we did kind of soon after graduating way back. And in that iteration, the porch was a kind of cut into the volume of the building that allowed the rain screen to kind of come down as a kind of porous wall in front of it to kind of screen the porch and allow access to that firewood. So it was more of a subtraction into the volume of the building. And in the kind of second iteration, or the one that is currently under construction, the porch became a little bit different. It became kind of part of those window volumes. And so that larger volume that you saw a little bit in the aerial photo, we're gonna get better photos once it's done, right? But that's a kind of very, very thin kind of steel structure, super thin, that projects into the building and becomes seating inside, and then projects through the thickness of that rain screen and cantilevers outwards. So it becomes a kind of window porch hybrid. That's how we're thinking about the porch in that one. And then that same language is used for a higher window that you can also occupy, and the kind of door that allows a threshold to enter the structure.
And part of the reason it evolved was because the first site for the competition was like fully in the woods. Maybe it's great to be outside in the woods, but there wasn't like a strong view line. But the site for actual construction has like just this beautiful vista, and you needed to be able to like be in between the inside and the outside. So that's the porch became like a bigger element in the second scheme. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you for the presentation to get you to meet you guys in person. Kind of like two questions. How much does your research kind of play into kind of how you approach teaching? Because I think what you guys are researching is fascinating, and this really kind of taking all of the material at once is just really, really awesome, especially with wood. And second, is there kind of an area with the wood that you're not really like sure about researching? Because I know like stuff like mulch, you could probably do something with that, or like the tree stumps. Is there like something kind of wanted to start to think about doing in the future with wood?
Sure. Yeah. Maybe to the first question, we both teach in both like foundational studios and advanced topics, and like building construction kind of core classes. So we kind of touch on all things, but I think like if we're teaching foundation studios, design and clarity and like cohesion is important to us. If we're teaching a material studio, like that's still important to us. So sometimes, like as you advance levels, you're able to work faster, but I feel like in some ways you're always teaching the same thing no matter what level or course.
Well, and like for example, I'm teaching a first semester graduate studio right now, so people with other backgrounds that are totally new to architecture for the first semester. It's really exciting, and we're doing a lot, foundational design stuff. But then like materials come in not with like going to a grasshopper and a robotic sawmill, because you have to build up to that maybe, but looking at like, well, what materials are we using for our models? Like, how does that material have agency in shaping the design of your structures, right? Are you using rockite? Are you using wood? If so, how are you cutting it, right? What's the kind of opportunities and the tools and how you're working that material to produce form, right? And so I think there are still relationships between material and fabrication that can form, even beginning design studios. But it's almost like we kind of see all these tools on a spectrum. So it's like you have a kind of order of learning things, right? You like maybe learn to use an X-Acto first and like cut chipboard, and then you might learn to like use a bandsaw or a table saw, and, right? And you kind of then maybe you learn to use a CNC, and then maybe you get to like building your own robotic tools, right? And so it's like building knowledge, but you're always thinking about these relationships, like what can the tool do? What are its limitations? How does it work the material? Where are the limitations in that? What does the material want to do that the tool resists? All of these relationships, I think, play out at different scales.
One of my favorite things to teach is like the materials and methods class, because you can learn both the traditional construction and the avant-garde stuff at once and see how they're rooted in, or how one is rooted in the other. Yeah, but it's a treat to teach a workshop like this that's super focused too, right? And it doesn't have like the whole like longevity of a whole semester, but it's like really direct.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I wonder how, as architects that also have a lot of hand skill and produce your projects sometimes yourselves, what is your relationship with the hand workers that have a specific background themselves, not in architecture, but wood or stone? Yeah.
I would say we're always eager and happy to learn from others. So even after spending however many years working with wood, I still feel like a novice with wood in some ways, right? I'm always learning new things. And so, yeah, on some of our like public art projects, we've gotten to collaborate with other makers or craftspeople. On some of the research projects, it's more kind of us as the makers or craftspeople. But yeah, I think there's a kind of dialogue there where you start at an intention and then you realize what the material actually wants, right? And some other people have been working in very specific ways with materials over time, might already have that knowledge. So there's a lot to learn from without having to make every kind of experiment and failure yourself.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think actually with a lot of the research work where we are building these things ourselves or with our student team, who a lot of the times we have to teach the techniques to, I think we are maybe missing out on some of that other knowledge, right? Of like people who have been with that craft or with that material for a long time, and that is something that we're learning more, like Katie mentions, from like working more in the wood world, even working with like forestry organizations, and understanding like what are the considerations that they're thinking about. Is it about like time? Is it about cost? Is it about material efficiency, right? How do you scale these things? I think there's a lot that we can learn there, but we also just love making, and when we can get like hands-on experience with the material, we always try to do that, because I don't think there's really any replacement for that level of like understanding of the material.
Hi, thanks to both of you for wonderful, inspiring presentation. Kind of a related question. It seems to me there's a sort of chicken and egg relationship between the technology you use and what you're able to do formally. And I'm just curious, do you ever interact with, say, equipment manufacturers? It's like, gee, if we could get an arm that does something else, it would be really great. Does that flow that way as well as their technology flowing to you, so to speak?
That's a great question. And that's something we haven't done a whole lot, but we're actively working on now. And so part of the trajectory of these projects, and one of the reasons we developed that sawmill in the first place was looking at some really great work being done by others with like bandsaw end effectors and robotic arm systems, right, which can accomplish a lot of what we're doing, but looking at how do we develop that as a more kind of democratized, accessible system that's also much lower cost and just transportable to different sites. And so we can just the system is on a trailer right now. We can like bring it somewhere with a small generator, have our electrical power, and deploy it. But we're also interested in usability, and so in this case, and the students have been familiarized with this workflow, we're just operating this machine directly from a Rhino model and using Grasshopper to generate code directly from a Rhino model. And so I think one of the challenges with robotic arms is that they're built for these industrial applications. They're kind of optimized for repeatable, like efficiency, right? Like a manufacturing line. And all the architecture schools have these tools now and are like not using them. It's like the opposite of that, right? They're like, we need to do something different every time. And so we're excited about this tool, and our process moving towards what you're suggesting is that we're working with our university and have like provisional patents on this technology now that we're looking to kind of bring to industry and say, well, like, how could this be valuable in your process? Like, where do you need kind of, new capabilities here, but also what's possible with these tools, and how can we bring these things beyond the scale of our like one-off research pavilions, into practice, so hopefully others could be able to use them in the future.
Yeah, along those lines, and maybe somebody else has a question, so I don't want to monopolize, but just along that, is there a way for you to enter into like a conversation with these manufacturers in order to extract the very material they don't want? Or, like, is there a point at which you can intervene and then say, okay, and we're going to take all that, like, is there a point in the material, I guess, just logistics, I guess, and can you're smiling, Katie, like you already are doing it.
If either of you have those contacts, like,
it just
like,
seems like there's probably a place where you guys can just like kind of say like, at that point, we'll take the rest, or you know what I mean? I wonder if there's kind of back to Miles' question, is there like these, like, is there a point at which maybe you guys are able to like kind of enter into that like a larger scale of like, okay, whenever you're done like cutting and then you're about to mulch, like we're going to take that. Thank you. I don't know. Is there a way that we can do that?
We should do that.
No, definitely. I think, there's like a lot of possibilities there. We've done that, I don't know, with like students on projects. I had students last semester that were getting like offcuts of this amazing stone from a local countertop manufacturer who had all these like fantastic like CNC tools, like tile saws cutting like huge slabs of stone, and they just had these like amazing soapstone offcuts that we were then able to cut and surface on the CNC in the architecture school. And so finding those like waste streams is, I think, one opportunity. But when we start looking at forestry, I think there's a couple different scales. Right now we're operating, again, with this local group on campus in a kind of urban forestry situation where there's not kind of larger pipelines. It's more about taking whatever material you can get and then finding what you can do with it, because it's not quite part of that industrial pipeline. And I think a lot of urban forestry organizations are taking that material and using it to do like bespoke large-scale timber frame structures, or maybe like furniture, kind of like woodworking scale projects. But so the way we might think about those opportunities on like the larger industrial scales that you're alluding to is really exciting, but I think we also need to be careful about scalability of these projects. And so
where you store all the wood.
Yeah.
I mean, also wood is really heavy. Before it's dried, it's super heavy. It loses a ton of moisture. It changes a lot dimensionally. So there are challenges, but we think about like the tangential timber dome with the cookies as being maybe a more bespoke process where there's a lot of like time in processing that material, and something like the crinkle cuts pavilion moving towards a kind of industrial scale of production where it's like a little bit more standardized, right? Still letting the material play a specific role, but I think that has the potential to operate or interface with like industrial production in a different way than some of the other projects. So we are thinking about those questions of scale and time and cost.
Is there anyone else?
Hi. First of all, thank you guys for being here, and it's nice to meet you in person. I was wondering if there are any projects you have on the horizon, or concepts or old competition entries that explore the intersection of the digital fabrication techniques and like analog, like handicraft, like chiseling textures, lathe work, anything like that, or if it's more like they're large scale and so it's mostly digital manufacturing, where you see that going with your practice.
Well, I'm curious what Kyle has to say, but one thing I would say
we
is,
don't always say the same thing.
I think in every digital fabrication project, there's a good amount of manual fabrication. there's just like such complexity to putting things together, right? And finishing material. And so I think embedded in these projects, and you'll see, I think, like beautiful videos of digital fabrication projects online and stuff too. And just knowing there's always a lot of like actual sweat that goes into those too. So that becomes a part of the process. But yeah, I'm curious how you'd answer it, Kyle.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to start the same way, right? There's like just an incredible amount of analog work that goes into any of these projects, even if they're like positioned and presented as like being about digital fabrication. Like just like manual labor is always like kind of huge part of that. And so in a way, I think it's been a part of all of the projects. Even thinking about like the crinkle cut system, which were these big Utley boards that were screwed together on site, or Sylvan Scrapple, which were the curved boards that were layered and pinned together with threaded rods on site. In those cases, we were thinking about like ease of assembly, working with a small team on site, no heavy equipment. So how do you break down that material, able to carry it in smaller units and assemble it there, as opposed to like pre-assembly with maybe more industrial processes that would then demand all this extra maybe time or cost or expense of heavy equipment. And so that does kind of play a role. But we're also, I wouldn't say we have any projects at the moment that are thinking specifically about that, because we're thinking more like on the industrial scale that Julie was alluding to. But we're talking to some collaborators recently about like thinking about sort of heavy scale, like large timber frame structures, and how would the kind of chiseling techniques and time required to cut these really laborious joints and heavy wood structures potentially be something that we could or couldn't accomplish with our tools, right? Would our tools need to be modified to accomplish that? And how do you think about that balance, right? When is it more efficient or better to like have the machine produce it, or when is it more efficient or better to have a hand and other tools produce it? And our answer is never that like the technology is always better. It's just that there's these different relationships or opportunities that come up, and you have to look at the kind of value set of each project and decide based on those specifics, how to go with a particular part of the process.
I think you might be getting at like more of a kind of craft tradition question, but I would say there is like maybe kind of two types of projects, even in the way that we're thinking, like the Sylvan Scrapple, like Exhibit Columbus project, or the Crinkle Cuts project are specifically about hand assembly. And that might be important relative to a discussion of something like the 2x4 or stick construction, because it specifically comes out of the relationship to the hand, or like the ability for people to carry lumber and erect it. If you think about mass timber construction at large, big CLT panel, it doesn't matter if you have 10 people, you're not lifting it, you need a crane or a gantry. And so they're just like, there's probably a good opportunity space in the hand construction area, right? How do you improve on the 2x4, but actually make something people can still edit and move and install themselves?
Thank you.
A lot of great questions.
Yeah.
This is fantastic.
Thank you for the lecture. What I found really interesting was your project where you used the invasive species, and I found that quite generative. And you just mentioned scalability earlier, and I'm quite curious how you would scale that project into more bigger projects.
Sure.
I can start.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question, and that's actually one of the things that we came up against having done that project and then looking for kind of next steps. And I think we found, like, because of the kind of, I don't know, like scrappiness or resourcefulness of like finding that material relative to earlier questions of like, where do you get this stuff, right? There's a lot of opportunity there. People are super interested in that project because they have personal connections to those materials, right? They identify with them as like kind of existing in this certain place within how we understand ecological systems, right? And so there's like interest in that, but there are a lot of challenges. And I think one of the things we found there was that, like working with kudzu, for example, we also use golden bamboo and invasive bamboo in Tennessee in that project. They have these amazing like fibrous structures. They're like really amazing structurally, and like the growth patterns are just super interesting as organisms with particular behaviors and material qualities and also cultural associations. but there's like a lot of processing that has to go into those materials, right? And so like those projects were ones that really dealt with like the hand and tools, and like working with our students on that, it was like, you know, soaking the material, like deconstructing the material on like a very granular level, and so there's a lot of labor involved with it. And so we found with those materials, there's both a lot of interest, but also a lot of challenges to scaling up to like larger industrial scales. And I imagine tools could be produced for that, but there'd be like a lot of development, like to automate some of those processes. And so that's part of the reason why some of our more recent work is thinking about timber in particular, because there are so many ways, like timber has such a long tradition in building that there is like so many established codes and things that we have to work with, right? Like the standards exist already. You don't have to kind of start from scratch to build them as you would maybe for like kudzu buildings. But we can then use this as a starting point and then more incrementally work from there towards these like more radical potentials or structures. And so we found that that was a kind of easier process, like kind of path of less resistance forward towards industrial scales of manufacture.
I would say though, I would be eager for you to take up the mantle of invasive species. And a couple of things you might look at is there's a group in Hawaii called the Albizia Project. Albizia Project. And essentially, I think the Albizia tree is native to Africa, but it was planted in Hawaii and it became invasive. And it's destroying ecosystems. So this group is using its wood to create all sorts of structures, which is really interesting. And there's a book coming out by Wendy Applequist called Love Them to Death. I don't remember what the subtitle is, yeah? But it's about using invasive plant species as material. So there's some like other people, I think, also in this discourse whose work you could look at.
And that's across scales, so not just looking at like architecture, right? Where you need like so much material and it needs to do so many different things, like resistant to water, acoustical, insulation, structure. Like sometimes those materials are good for like one of those things and can maybe be part of like larger assemblies, right? Whereas in our projects, we're kind of using mono-material assemblies, trying to prove one thing with them. So I think there's possibilities there, but also thinking about like beyond architecture, other scales of design, how could we find utility for those materials, right? That wouldn't demand such a quantity as, you know, making a building.
All right, I think you guys had a long day. So I think we'll probably end it here, but thank you so much. We really appreciate it. Thank you. Wonderful lecture.